In the spring of 2025, Scoot Henderson was 21 years old and already an answered question. The question was how the Portland Trail Blazers could have used the third overall pick of one of the most celebrated NBA drafts in modern history on a player this disappointing. In ESPN redraft articles, in podcast roundtables, in Twitter threads that piled up by the thousand, the consensus had already formed. He was a bust. He was the cautionary tale of the 2023 class. He was the kid who had been picked behind Victor Wembanyama and would never recover from that fact. 12 months later, in his first ever NBA playoff series, against the very team that had taken Wembanyama with the pick that came before his own, Scoot Henderson is rewriting his own obituary in real time. And what almost nobody is willing to say publicly as he carries the Portland Trail Blazers through the first round of an NBA playoffs nobody expected him to even appear in, is that the entire basketball world may have written off the wrong player 12 months too early. If you want to understand what it actually cost a young man to be drafted third in a class that belonged to someone else, and what it looks like when that same young man decides in front of a national television audience that the silence is finally over, stay with us. This channel tells the NBA stories the highlights would rather forget. He was born on February 28, 2004 in Marietta, Georgia, the kind of town that exists in the gravitational pull of Atlanta without ever being Atlanta itself. His family was a basketball family before he understood what the word meant. His older sisters played. His parents drove him to gyms. By the time he was 8 years old, he was already being filmed in workout videos that were starting to circulate among AAU coaches in the Southeast, the way rumors travel before names do. There is a clip of him at 13, listed at 5'9", dribbling between the legs of high school seniors as if he had read the scouting report on each of them in the car on the way over. The scouts who saw him then did not say he reminded them of someone. They said he reminded them of no one. There was no comparison readily available, and the absence of a comparison in basketball is the highest compliment a young guard can receive. By his sophomore year of high school, the entire industry knew his name. By his junior year, it was no longer a question of whether he would play professionally before college. It was a question of where and for how much. In 2021, at the age of 17, the NBA's developmental league granted him an eligibility waiver, and he signed with the G League Ignite, becoming one of the youngest paid professional basketball players in the history of American sport. He left high school early to play against grown men. He left adolescence early to chase a draft slot. The story of his life, even before it had really begun, was already a story of acceleration, of being asked to be older than he was, of being placed again and again in rooms where the other people in the room had been given more time to become who they were. The destiny had been assembled around him before he was ever allowed to choose it. And the most demanding room of his life, he did not yet know, was waiting for him in 2 summers' time on a stage in Brooklyn on the night of June 22, 2023. His 2 seasons with the G League Ignite were, by every meaningful metric, a success. He averaged 17 points and almost 7 assists in his second year against opponents who had already spent careers as professional athletes and who treated him on every possession like a target rather than a teammate. By the time the 2023 NBA draft cycle began, the only real debate in scouting departments around the league was the order of the top 3. Wembanyama was first. Wembanyama had been first since he was 16 years old and 7'4". The second pick, the Charlotte Hornets, would eventually take Brandon Miller out of Alabama. And the third pick, the Portland Trail Blazers, was almost universally projected to belong to Scoot Henderson. There were even teams in the top of the lottery who tried, in the weeks leading up to the draft, to trade up to get him. The Portland Trail Blazers head coach Chauncey Billups, himself a former number 3 overall pick, was asked about Henderson before the draft and responded with the kind of evaluation that follows a young player for the rest of his career. He called him the most explosive young guard he had seen in years. The night of the draft, Adam Silver read Wembanyama's name first, and the building stood. He read Brandon Miller's name second, and the building cheered. He read Scoot Henderson's name third, and the building by then was already turning its attention back to the Frenchman who would now have to share a draft class with him. Henderson walked across the stage in a deep wine-colored suit, hugged his mother, and put on a Portland Trail Blazers cap. He was 19 years old. He had just been drafted higher than 97% of the players who would ever play in the NBA. And he had also just been drafted second among the only 2 names that the country was ever going to remember from that night. But basketball rarely writes the story you expect. His rookie season in Portland was the kind of season that nobody plans for and everybody recognizes when they see it. He averaged 14 points and just over 5 assists per game on shooting splits that, for a guard taken 3rd overall, read like an indictment. 38.5% from the field, 32.5% from 3. The advanced metrics were worse than the box score. He was, by net rating, one of the least productive starters in the entire league. The Trail Blazers, having traded Damian Lillard the previous summer to officially begin the rebuild around him, lost 21 of his first 25 starts. By the All-Star break, the basketball internet had already begun running the comparison that, for a young player, is the most lethal comparison of all. They began comparing him to other lottery picks who would never become what they were drafted to be. Marvin Bagley, Anthony Bennett, names that exist in the league's memory not as players but as warnings. His sophomore year was, on paper, slightly better. The numbers crept upward, the percentages improved by a measurable but unremarkable margin, and yet the narrative around him calcified into something almost impossible to undo. By the spring of 2025, ESPN ran the redraft of his class and placed him, the player who had been the consensus number 3 the night of the draft, outside the top 10 of his own group. There were analysts on national television, men paid to evaluate basketball players for a living, who used the word bust. They used it casually. They used it on podcasts. They used it as if the question had already been settled and the only thing left to do was to officially close the book. He was 21 years old. He had played fewer than 150 NBA games. And the league had already decided what he was. What it cost a young man to live inside that decision while still going to work every night in front of 18,000 people who paid for tickets to watch him fail is a story the box score does not record. It is the story under the story. It is the silence after the buzzer, in the tunnel, walking past cameras, knowing that the highlight reel is being cut without you. And it is the story he would carry almost alone into the summer of 2025, into the longest off-season of his life, and into the regular season that would quietly, methodically change everything. The 2025 through 26 regular season was not a redemption arc. Not yet. Redemption arcs require an audience, and the audience had largely stopped watching. What it was, instead, was the patient and almost invisible accumulation of a player rebuilding himself in front of cameras that had been repointed elsewhere. His scoring climbed. His assist numbers climbed. His efficiency, which had been the central charge against him, began to look like the efficiency of a starting NBA point guard rather than the efficiency of a project. By the trade deadline, advanced metrics analysts who had buried him a year earlier were quietly publishing follow-up pieces with titles that included words like reassessment and second look. The Trailblazers, who had been projected to finish in the bottom four of the Western Conference, finished as the 7th seed and earned a first-round playoff matchup against the San Antonio Spurs and Victor Wembanyama. The bracket itself was a script no novelist would have dared to submit. Of every team in the league, of every possible first-round pairing the lottery balls of the previous Tuesday could have produced, Scoot Henderson was going to play his first ever NBA playoff series against the man who had been drafted directly in front of him. Game 1 was on April 19th. Wembanyama scored 35 points in his playoff debut. The Spurs won by 13. The story, on the surface, was the same story it had always been. The Frenchman dominated. The kid drafted behind him was one more obstacle in a coronation that had been booked since the previous summer. And then came Game 2. Game 2 was played on April 21st in San Antonio, and it lasted, in the basketball memory of anyone who watched it, somewhere between 48 minutes and the rest of Scoot Henderson's career. In the second quarter, Wembanyama collided with a teammate in transition and went into the league's concussion protocol, and the building, knowing what they had just lost, went briefly and unmistakably quiet. Portland was down by 14 points entering the fourth quarter. The Spurs had not blown a fourth-quarter playoff lead of that size in 76 playoff games, a streak that stretched back to 2003. Henderson finished with 31 points on 11 of 17 shooting. 13 of those points came in the first quarter, before Wembanyama left the floor, which is the detail that the next morning's recaps quietly buried because the convenient story was that Henderson exploded only after the Frenchman went down. The truth was that he was already exploding. He had simply not been allowed, in the version of the narrative the country had agreed upon, to be the kind of player who explodes. He hit a step-back jumper with 2 minutes left to give Portland its first lead of the second half. He drew a charge on the other end against a Spurs guard 10 years his senior. He found a cutting teammate for a layup with under a minute to play that the broadcast booth in real time struggled to put into words. Portland won 106 to 103. The series was tied at 1, And somewhere in the long walk from the floor to the visiting locker room in San Antonio, on a night his sport had spent 2 years insisting was never going to come, Scoot Henderson stopped being a story about a draft pick and became finally a story about a basketball player. What came next, no one in the building saw coming. He has not yet given the long, reflective, post-series interview that this kind of arc usually produces. The series is still being played. As of the writing of this script, Game 3 is in progress in Portland, with Wembanyama still in concussion protocol and Henderson again carrying the Trailblazers' offense in a way the regular season had only hinted at. What he has said in the brief and guarded press availabilities of the last week has been almost suspiciously calm. He has thanked his teammates. He has thanked his coach. He has refused, every single time the question has been asked, to compare himself to Wembanyama or to relitigate the draft order of 2023. The maturity in those press conferences is not the maturity of a young man who has won something. It is the maturity of a young man who has spent 2 years being told in public that he was not who he believed himself to be, and who has decided somewhere in the last 8 months that he is no longer going to argue with strangers about it. There's a clip from a sideline interview after Game 2 in which the reporter asks him what changed. He pauses. He looks past the camera for a moment, the way young athletes do when they are trying to choose a sentence that will not be turned against them in the morning. And then he simply says that nothing changed, that he is the same player he has always been, and that the only thing different is the time of year. It is, on its surface, a sports cliché. Listened to carefully, it is something else. It is a young man telling the country, without raising his voice, that he was always this. That the version of him the audience accepted as the real version for 2 long seasons was a version assembled out of expectations that never belonged to him in the first place. He was not supposed to be Wembanyama. He was never supposed to be Wembanyama. He was supposed to be Scoot Henderson, drafted 3rd overall in the year of the Frenchman, asked to grow up in public on a rebuilding team, asked to become a franchise player at an age when most of his peers were still arguing about playing time in college locker rooms. The bus narrative was never about basketball. It was about the impossible weight of being adjacent to a generational talent and being asked by the entire sport to justify why you were not him. And the most honest and difficult thing about what is happening right now on the floor of the Moda Center is that it is not a redemption. It is a clarification. It is the same player finally in conditions that allow him to look like himself. Whether the Portland Trail Blazers can finish what Scoot Henderson has started against a team that may or may not get its number 1 overall pick back before the series is over is a question this video cannot answer. Because the question has not yet been asked of the floor. What can be answered is something quieter and more important. The bus narrative that followed Scoot Henderson for 2 years has already, regardless of the final score of this series, been broken. Not by a press release, not by a redraft article, by a player, on a court, in front of cameras that finally turned back toward him. And the only honest way to ask the closing question of a story like this is to ask it in the form he himself seems to be asking it. Is what we are watching the beginning of the career he was always supposed to have? Or Is it the last and hardest version of the lesson that the league spends decades teaching its youngest players? That the draft order is not the story, the player is the story, and the story takes longer than anyone is patient enough to wait for. If this kind of long-form NBA storytelling is what you came here for, you already know what to do. We have a video on the night Damian Lillard left Portland and what that night really cost the franchise that drafted Scoot Henderson 11 months later, and we think you should watch it next. Subscribe for the NBA stories the highlights would rather forget. We will be here when Game 4 tips off. And we will be here long after the series is over, regardless of who wins it, because the player at the center of it has already, in the quiet way the best players always do, won the only argument that ever really mattered.